Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tudor and today we're going to be diving back into the world of economics. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the concept of purchasing power parity, how it relates to exchange rates, and why it matters to the world around us. So right off the bat, you're probably wondering, what is purchasing power parity? Well, there are two main types of PPP. The first is relative purchasing power parity. In its most basic form, relative PPP is a concept that explains how exchange rates in different countries adjust the prices of identical goods to be the same over time. However, if one of the countries has a higher inflation rate than another, then that country's currency will depreciate in order to offset the difference in price levels, ensuring that the purchasing power of both currencies remains equal. Now, the second form of PPP is absolute PPP. Absolute PPP directly compares the price levels across countries without taking into account inflation, and assumes that 1. Goods cost the same when the price is adjusted worldwide, and 2. The nominal exchange rate is equal to the ratio of the country's price levels. Now, if you're still a little unclear, hopefully this example will make things a little more easier to understand for you. Now, let's say I buy one basket of goods in Canada for $100. And that exact same basket of goods costs 80 euros in a European country like Germany. Well, PPP says that exchange rate should equalize so that $1 Canadian buys just enough euros to make it so that the price of the baskets is exactly the same. This equation shows that $1 Canadian should exchange for 0.8 euros, or equivalently, €1 can be exchanged for 1.25 Canadian dollars. But in reality, this is not actually the case. At the time of the recording of this video, the actual exchange rate between the Canadian dollar and the euro is $1 Canadian will buy you 0.6 euros. That means the Canadian dollar buys fewer euros than the PPP predicts. So it is undervalued relative to the euro. So what happens in this scenario? Well, if the goods are cheaper in Canada when the price is converted to euros, European buyers would end up purchasing more of those Canadian goods. This would subsequently increase the demand for the Canadian dollar, causing it to appreciate and move the exchange rate closer to the actual PPP value. Think of it as a form of gravity well. Yes, in the short term, the currencies will diverge. But through trading and price forcing, their values will be brought back towards the PPP equilibrium value over time. Now, before diving more deeply into PPP, I probably should stop and take a second to describe what exactly an exchange rate is. In layman's terms, an exchange rate is the price of one currency in terms of a second. It tells us how much foreign currency we can buy with 1 unit of domestic currency. Now, exchange rates can be nominal, meaning the actual market rate we see quoted on various financial platforms, or real, which adjusts for differences in price levels between countries. Now, the real exchange rate is especially important for PPP because it gives us the real purchasing power, and it is given by this equation that you see on screen. Now, when the real exchange rate is equal to 1, it means that the PPP holds exactly. Goods cost the same in both countries when the prices are converted into a common currency. In the real world, though, exchange rates fluctuates due to interest rate changes, capital flows, speculation, and policy shifts. Now, these short-run forces often move currencies away from their PPP value, but the PPP acts as a sort of long-term anchor so that the prices tend to move back towards their expected PPP values. Let's take a real-world style example to make this even more clear. Let's say that the Canadian economy is doing exceptionally well, and global demand for Canadian exports such as lumber or oil increases drastically. In order to pay for these goods, foreign buyers must purchase more of the Canadian dollar, causing the Canadian dollar to appreciate in value, meaning it becomes stronger relative to other currencies. Now, on the other hand, imagine that Canada experiences much higher inflation than its trading partners. As the prices rise domestically, Canadian goods become more expensive relative to the cost of foreign goods. Foreign buyers then reduce the demand for Canadian exports, and Canadian consumers start importing more. This reduces the demand for the Canadian dollar, increases the supply on the foreign exchange market. In turn, this causes the Canadian dollar to depreciate in value. These kinds of market forces, driven by trade flows and inflation, are the same forces that the PPP relies on in order to explain long-term adjustments in the exchange rates. So now you're probably wondering, how exactly are exchange rates and PPP more explicitly connected? Well, the PPP suggests that changes in the inflation rates across countries causes corresponding shifts among exchange rates in order to maintain an equal purchasing power. Let's say that Canada's inflation rate rises faster than that of Germany's. That means that the prices in Canada are rising relative to the prices of Germany. For identical goods to cost the same in both countries when converted into a common currency, the value of the Canadian dollar must depreciate. If Canada's inflation rate lowers, then Canadian goods become relatively cheaper, and the Canadian dollar should then appreciate. The relative PPP formula captures this relationship. The formula says that a % change in the exchange rate equals the difference between the domestic and the foreign inflation rates. For example, if Canada's inflation rate is 5% and Germany's inflation rate is 2%, then we'd expect the Canadian dollar to depreciate by roughly 3% in the long run to restore purchasing power parity. You can actually visualize this long run adjustment using this diagram. On the vertical axis, we have the real exchange rate, and on the horizontal axis, the current account balance. The upward sloping red line represents how the current account depends on the real exchange rate. As the domestic currency depreciates, exports rise and imports fall, improving the current account. The vertical blue line shows the difference between national output and absorption, or spending. The point where the two lines intersect marks the long-run equilibrium real exchange rate, where the goods market and external balance are both in equilibrium. This theoretical link is what makes purchasing power parity a cornerstone of international macroeconomics, as it connects the goods market, like prices and inflation, to the currency market, like exchange rates. Now let's dive a bit deeper into how inflation drives PPP adjustments over time. Now imagine two large economies, Canada and, let's say, the United States, since they are massive trading partners. If Canada's inflation becomes 6% and America's stays at 2%, well, then the price of Canadian goods becomes more expensive relative to the price of American goods. As that price gap widens, US consumers and companies will shift from purchasing Canadian goods and look into purchasing domestically or from other countries. Meanwhile, Canadians might start buying more imported American products due to the prices being relatively cheaper. These changes in trade flows depreciate the demand for the Canadian dollar and increases the demand for the American dollar. As a result, the Canadian dollar depreciates in the foreign exchange market. Over time, this depreciation offsets the inflation difference. Canadian exports will then start to become cheaper again for Americans to purchase, and the purchasing power of parity value is gradually restored. This self-correction is what makes PPP so important when trying to understand the long-run exchange rate behavior changes. However, it's also important to recognize the limitations of the PPP. In the short run, many factors can actually prevent it from holding its value steady. Aspects such as trade barriers, transportation costs, or goods and services that aren't easily comparable. But despite these short-term deviations, long-term empirical data suggests the exact opposite and shows that over long periods of time, exchange rates tend to move toward the PPP equilibrium, especially when the inflation differentials are persistent. Whew! That was probably a lot of information to process in such a short period of time. So let's just quickly recap everything we went over in a couple short bullet points. Number 1, PPP links prices, inflation, and exchange rates. It is based on the law of one price, the idea that no matter where you go in the world, identical goods should always cost the same when converted into a common currency. Number 2, absolute PPP compares price levels, whereas relative PPP focuses on inflation and how that affects exchange rates over time. Number 3, When one country's inflation rate is higher than another, its currency will depreciate in value in order to restore PPP. Number 4, in the long run, PPP acts as a sort of equilibrium anchor for exchange rates. Even though short-run factors such as changes in monetary policies can cause temporary deviations. Understanding PPP gives us a clear idea of why exchange rates move the way that they do and how inflation links the goods market and the currency market in an open economy. Phew, now that definitely was a lot to process just for me. But hopefully this video gave you a better idea on what purchasing power parity and exchange rates actually are. As an economics student myself, sometimes the information can get a little scrambled up in my head just from the sheer fact of me having to process so much information all the time. And believe me, that isn't helped by profs or other YouTube explanation videos, which just start going hog wild and throwing out so much techno jargon without really stopping to explain just what it is that they're actually trying to say. Hence why I kind of like these shorter videos. They act as good little refreshers for concepts that you may or may not know. But the key thing is they make the information a lot more digestible and easy to understand. Now, for the usual stuff, if you like this video, give it a like, hit that subscribe button. If you like videos like this or reviews or little animations, drop a comment down below if you found that this helped you with your grasp or understanding with these concepts as it helps with the YouTube algorithm. And I will see you guys in the next video. So, peace out, have a good day, and goodbye.